I want to welcome you to our opening plenary. I'm Mark Kramer, founder and managing director of FSG. FSG is a global nonprofit strategy and evaluation firm that works with organizations around the world on how to find better ways to solve social problems. And it is my pleasure to moderate this session this morning on Not Your Parents' Giving, Leveraging All Sectors for Social Change. I think we heard a very good setup for this session yesterday. We heard about how media is being untethered and creating new opportunities and leverage points for social change. We heard from Rajiv Shah about partnerships that the State Department is undertaking with business and with philanthropy that makes them much more effective. We heard from Tony Blair about the role of philanthropy in improving governance. And I think our panelists today are going to extend and continue that conversation about new ways to leverage social change as philanthropists that go well beyond simply writing checks. We're going to begin. We really are very honored to have with us today Tony Elumelu. Tony Elumelu is the chairman of Heirs Holding Limited, an African investment company that is committed to economic transformation in Africa through long-term investments that generate both economic prosperity and social wealth. He's the founder of the Tony Elumelu Foundation, an Africa-based and African-funded philanthropy whose mission is to identify and groom African business leaders and entrepreneurs to enhance the competitiveness and growth of Africa's private sector. We're going to ask Tony to come up and speak to us for about 20 minutes, and afterwards he will come join us on a panel for a more engaged discussion. Thank you. Please welcome Tony Elumelu.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Hope we're enjoying our breakfast. I'd like to start by thanking the organizers of this wonderful global platform for creating the opportunity for all of us to be here today, and in fact, for the week. I would like to share a certain concept, philosophy, and approach that my colleagues and I have come up with as a way of supporting the economic transformation that is going on in Africa. We call it Afri-capitalism. I'm going to spend the next few minutes discussing this. But first, I'd like to put the context, the stage for this concept and this philosophy that we have all embraced at the Tony Elumelu Foundation. So I start with my past and how it's helping to shape this new belief and way of doing things. In 1997, some investors, I led a group of investors that decided to acquire a distressed bank in Nigeria. We acquired the bank and were able to quickly turn around the bank. And within a period of 5 years, we IPO'd the bank. With initial public offer, we IPO'd the bank and made it a public institution. When we started with about, in today's terms, say about $5 million. Sorry, then $5 million. And after about 10 years, or within a period of 10 years, we were able to execute the biggest financial services merger in Sub-Saharan Africa, excluding South Africa, by bringing the bank that we acquired, that was distressed, which we rechristened as Standard Trust Bank, which had grown then to become the 5th largest bank in Nigeria, with the 3rd largest bank in Nigeria called United Bank for Africa. And by that merger, we created the biggest financial services group in Nigeria, and in fact in West Africa at the time. there were some learning points in this career advancement, which has shaped the kind of philosophy that we have embraced and which we propagate today across Africa. In 2010, I retired as the CEO of BBA after spending about 13 and a half years. When I retired, I founded two institutions. The Hess Holdings, which is an African investment proprietary company, and that is for profit, and the Tony Elumelu Foundation, which is not for profit. And as the moderator said, we want to see how we can catalyze the private sector, how we can encourage the rise of entrepreneurship in Africa, how we can assist people who have startup businesses move from startup to medium scale, and those who are medium SMEs to move from SME to national growth companies, and those who are national growth companies to move to become the African multinational corporations. So this is what we intend to do through the foundation. Now, what are the learning points so far in the career advancement? First was, we realized in growing United Bank for Africa how we started. We started with about $5 million. And so $5 million in 1997 has helped to achieve a lot of things, both for us as investors and also for the African public. We've been able, with $5 million, to grow, establish brand network of about 1,000 branches across Africa, to recruit, employ, direct employment about 25,000 Africans, to pay taxes in those countries where, to grow, to expand into 19 African countries. And we pay tax in these African countries. So we started asking ourselves, just $5 million in 1997, we were able to achieve all of this. At some point, before the market correction, the capitalization of the bank on the exchange was $6 billion. So a lot has happened by making a $5 million investment at some point. Now we try to relate this to the level, what we've been able to achieve with the level of aid money that come into Africa. Almost on a monthly basis, we get, in different sectors, more than $5 million. But if you take statistics of how $5 million at a particular point in time, seeded by way of aid or donation, if you begin to wonder if that's created even a tenth of the impact that we have been able to achieve. So the thinking started therefore on us that maybe what Africa needs is really not just aid and donor funds. And maybe we need to begin to rethink the intervention approach and mechanism and how we help to grow the economic transformation of Africa. A second learning point for us was when we started, we said, because we were turning around a distressed bank, what was uppermost in our mind was to be able to attract customers to the banking hall. And so we did not discriminate as the traditional Nigerian banks would do at the time. We said to ourselves that we wanted to democratize access to banking facilities, access to banking services. It was not a deliberate social action at the time. It was not. It was an economic action or decision we took that if we must turn around this distressed institution, we need to open it up. But we learned quickly from it, and that is why it's influencing today's behavior and thinking and philosophy. We quickly learned that even though we're trying to create access or democratize, as we said then, quite revolutionary at the time, access to banking services, we realized that to do that, we had to open branches across the country, and we quickly ramped up our branch network to about 700 branches in the country. We realized that those communities we went to serve, that were not served before, embraced the bank. As we did well, they prospered. As they prospered, the bank did better. So we said, wow, there's something interesting here. A pattern is beginning to emerge and evolve. So we decided to replicate the same thing across Africa, hence the expansion across Africa. So within a period of 5 years, we had a massive expansion because we saw Africa a lot of opportunities, but lacking in certain areas, payment system, trade, facilitation, and finance, etc. So the lesson for us there is that, indeed, corporations can do good and do well, and do both simultaneously, not one waiting for the other. Not to say, let us wait to do well before we begin to think of how to do good. That in fact, if you integrate both and do both simultaneously, you can even create in fact, we operated in communities where the villagers, I recall someone calling me and saying, we want UBA in our community, and I'm going to donate the house for UBA to run a branch. And UBA is a profit-making organization, but someone is saying, we'll give you a house to run. And so communities were supportive of UBA. There was shared destiny. And so it was a very interesting point that influenced some of what we are doing today. The third point, and to me the most significant of all, was we invested long-term. We made long-term investments. We did not do short-term investments. I recall one of my directors at a meeting. We had done so well in terms of profitability, and he wanted us to increase our dividend policy, payment policy. And I said, sir, it would be nice for us to recapitalize, plow back part of our profit because of the future. And he says, Tony, I'm 66 years old. You're a very young man. I want to have my dividends now. But we were largely long-term. The investment, in fact, our investment history has always been one of long-term investments. The expansion into Africa by United Bank for Africa, I told people, is not one that many institutions can embark upon, especially at the time UBA embarked upon this mission. And UBA paid dearly for it also. But UBA knows that in the medium to long term, you make significant returns on those investments. So what, therefore, putting all these three together, we started thinking that maybe we need to redefine how to engage in Africa, to do things in Africa, if the purpose is to create economic growth and development. And that was what gave rise to the concept of Afro-capitalism. So simply put to us, Afro-capitalism is a philosophy, an approach that is predicated on the fact that for growth and economic development to occur in Africa, certain things must happen. One, we think it should be led by the private sector. Led by the private sector does not mean it should only be the private sector. We have the private sector or the public sector, we have the social sector. But we think that Africa should be led and run almost like business that has the interests of all the stakeholders. We think that getting funds from outside is good, but it can be channeled better. It can be done in a way that is catalytic. It can be done in a way that it creates long-term and sustainable value. And that we should not just seek to attract either donor funds or even investment capital for the sake of it. It should come in to address certain specific objectives that must produce economic prosperity, social wealth, in a manner that is sustainable, and not just come do something one day. So this whole essence of this concept of Afro-capitalism, we think that the African private sector, and African private sector does not necessarily mean African indigenes. The entrepreneurs, the investors who do business in Africa, we call them the African private sector, should come together and show greater commitment to the economic transformation of Africa. We think that we can do good and do well and do good. We believe that economic prosperity and social wealth can indeed go together from the experience that we have seen in our entrepreneurial and business drive. And even after leaving the United Bank of Africa as CEO, the Heirs Holdings has made quite some other investments. In fact, both Heirs Holdings and the Tony Elumelu Foundation, the objective is similar. It's about creating economic growth and development in Africa using different approaches. We have embarked on more along the lines of what we did at UBA. And we are calling other private sector players in Africa, the African entrepreneurs, those who are well endowed in Africa, that a $5 million investment in 1997 has created the kind of economic prosperity for shareholders and social wealth for the general public. And that others can even do better because they could even be more endowed in terms of resources. This basically is a concept of Afro-capitalism. The private sector must lead. The public sector must create the enabling and competitive environment for business to do well. The social sector must redefine how to engage so that it's sustainable, long-lasting. We think that as we make investments, we should have at the back of our minds, in fact, it should be implicit, it should be part of our investment criteria analysis. Does it have social impact? Is it sustainable? Will it create value? We believe that the interplay of all of this will create a better African society. Thank you. So this basically, I'm told I have 4 more minutes, or then I'm done. This basically is what Afro-capitalism is about. I'm happy to take comments from the audience. Thank you.
Let me invite now our other panelists to the stage. This is the kind of panel that you have only at GPF, where we have a gentleman from Africa, a gentleman from Singapore, and a woman from Brazil, all of whom are remarkable examples of effective and innovative philanthropy. So let me introduce Carol Civita, a philanthropist who is committed to strengthening the growing philanthropic sector in Brazil. She is a member of the Civita family in Brazil. She learned about philanthropy from her family's foundation, but as she will tell you, she has gone beyond the family foundation to create her own approach and areas for impact. So Carol, please join us.
Thank you.
Let me also introduce Laurence Lien, who is a champion of the nonprofit sector in Singapore. He is the chairman of Lien Foundation and CEO of the National Volunteer and Philanthropy Center and Community Foundation of Singapore. He is currently also a nominated member of Parliament and advocates for the social sector and civil society. Laurence.
Thank you.
So I'd like to begin by asking Laurence and then Carol to say a few words about their involvement in philanthropy and the approach they've brought. And then I want to go back to Tony's excellent comments and engage in a conversation together, and engage in a conversation with you, and engage in a conversation with those on the web who are following us there as well. So Laurence, you've picked some unpopular topics to focus your philanthropy on. Topics like end of life and sanitation and access to toilets. You work not just in Singapore, but across Asia in other countries as well. Tell us a little bit about your philanthropy and about how you have leveraged impact beyond just writing checks.
Okay. Thanks, Mark, for that generous introduction. Well, my own philanthropic journey started about 10 years ago when I was conscripted into the family foundation. Conscripted because when my grandfather, who founded the foundation, said, please be on the board, it's not really a request, it's really an order. But I was very happy to, because I was the only third generation who was on the board. And I decided that no, we had to broaden our approach, which was very much geared towards the traditional area of education, which is very popular in our part of the world. And we looked at the most critical problems in Singapore and around the region. And we decided that aging, elder care, was the most critical problem that Singapore was facing, because we were one of the fastest aging populations in the world. And within elder care, we picked something very unpopular, end-of-life issues, dying. And we got people to talk about death, in a culture where talking about dying is taboo. And in the environment, we picked water and sanitation, and that's strictly outside Singapore, and we have few offices in Cambodia, Vietnam, and China. And our approach is really, our tagline is radical philanthropy, which means picking unpopular topics, complex topics that we are passionate about, so that you have the sweet spot of the confluence of public interest and private value, and tackling the root cause of the issues, being very focused, gathering expertise over many years of working on the issues. So, for example, we work on national policy. We set up a national center for palliative care 4 years ago in Singapore. And just last year, the government decided that they wanted the center to come up with a national blueprint, a national strategy for palliative care in Singapore. We decided that we needed to go even beyond our shores, beyond Singapore. So we have done some work in, I think all of you have heard of quality of life indices. So we commissioned the Economist Intelligence Unit to come up with a quality of death index, which you can see here. So they came out with the Quality of Death Index, which ranked 40 countries around the world on end-of-life care. And Singapore was 18 out of 40 countries, so that got our decision makers very upset, because they like to be 1, 2, or 3. And UK, incidentally, UK is number 1, Australia 2, and New Zealand 3. US is 9. And we got and this gets people talking. It holds governments accountable. And we got into advocacy, because we think that, that is, especially when you're taking a taboo topic, you want people to talk about it and address it. And so we commissioned a film. And this came out this year, and this is internationally released. So if you go livebeforedeath.com, you can order this. And it's won quite a few awards in the international film circuit, called Life Before Death, looking at pain relief and the lack of access. And it's also very much a training video for, a lot of little snippets, short films for palliative care physicians, healthcare professionals to work with, to use in their own countries and contexts. And so I think the summary is this. We like to take a more radical approach, because we think that philanthropy gives you the opportunity to take risks. I think we have mentioned all these before. I think Jane mentioned, you can You can take risks, you can use your entrepreneurial instincts and skill set. You can take a long-term view. And you can do a lot of things that, as Mr. Tony Blair said yesterday, governments cannot do or will not do because they don't have the political will. And you can do things better. It's a lot more responsive to the ground. You can take much more innovative approaches. And so I decided also to do it on a national basis, as a center, the CEO of the National Volunteer and Philanthropy Center, and found that, well, overseeing your own family's philanthropy is a lot easier than convincing other people to do philanthropy and taking a strategic view. So that is really for the long haul. But I think in Asia, the time has really come with unprecedented wealth creation, that we see that there are a lot of people who are starting to think about philanthropy, and we want to gather them, and that's why we're also partnering Global Philanthropy Forum in starting this series called the Philanthropy in Asia Summit, convening philanthropists from all around Asia to come to Singapore in September. So if any of you have any activities in Asia, please send me an email, and I'll give you an invite. And we'll see where we can go from there.
Great. Thanks you so much, Laurence. That's terrific and very inspiring. Carol, you've really begun to engage with nonprofits and communities far beyond the way a family foundation typically does. Tell us a little bit about your work and what you've heard in the communities.
Okay, thank you, Mark, for the question, and thank you for the Global Philanthropy Forum. It's a pleasure to be here representing Brazil. I was very pleased to see a panel about Brazil yesterday. I would like to tell you a little bit about my background. My involvement with philanthropy comes through my husband's family. It all started in 1985 with a visionary, my husband's grandfather, Victor Civita, who imagined a better country through education. And he was more specific. He decided to concentrate on teachers. He believed that the teachers were the channel for the future of education in Brazil, and decided to publish a magazine that today is distributed to 1 million teachers in Brazil from north to south. They reach more than 5,000 public schools in Brazil. And this magazine is dedicated to helping teachers enhance their skills in elementary classrooms. Also, the Victor Civita Foundation has created a prize that offers teachers recognition for their work and benefits so that they can improve their personal skills with higher education. After 27 years, I understood that the infrastructure for the Victor Civita Foundation was doing well, and I decided that I needed to help in further ways. I decided to understand how the NGOs work in Brazil. As many of you might know, the economic growth in Brazil is very positive, and we have very favorable political grounds. And for the past years, more than 340,000 NGOs have been born in Brazil. So I decided that I needed to understand how they function, because I personally believe that no one knows better what a community needs than the community itself. So I thought that reinventing the wheel was not necessary. We just needed to listen what was going on. So I started to work closer to the NGOs and listen to what their necessities were. The only problem I found is that with such a big number of NGOs, we needed more collaboration. And apart from all the resources that the donors could offer for the NGOs, I think that the most important resource is time, and putting them together to talk to each other and share their experiences and their failures and their success stories, which are very similar. I like to make a parallel to that. I don't know if you've watched a movie called Groundhog Day with Bill Murray, where he relives his day every day. Well, since I've decided not to affiliate myself to any specific NGOs, I've been participating in many meetings for the past 2 years. And the feeling I have is that I've been in that same meeting over and over again. So I said, well, I think that these people need to talk to each other. And if they are able to talk to each other and share experiences, this will allow them not to waste the resources they have. Because if you put groups who are dedicated to the same causes together, they will come up with a lot of ideas and creativity. Mark was asking me if I could give an example. I like to give an example of the Victor Civita Foundation. Distributing 1 million magazines in Brazil is very complicated, and getting into schools in the Amazon is not a simple thing. So publishing the magazine is very important, but how do you get this magazine to the right people, to the right teachers? Well, no one knows it better than the community. So the magazines in the Amazon are canoed through the Amazon River to the teachers. And the community does it. No one knows how to do that better than the community. So I've decided to listen and to try to use my time, my knowledge, and my connections, which I believe is what I have as an asset, to put people together and to bring the donors closer to the causes, because I believe also that if you do not understand the cause, if you do not live the cause, if you do not experience the cause, then you will not have long-term engagement. And this is the only way to have it. So I hope that my children, through the Victor Civita Foundation, will have the opportunity to visit the classrooms and the teachers that the foundation helped, so that they understand what is behind it and how they can be more helpful for Brazil.
Thank you, Carol. What a terrific conversation, and I am impressed that we have here 3 outstanding philanthropists, none of whom are talking about writing checks or doing philanthropy in a conventional sense at all. Laurence is very involved with public policy. Tony has made a compelling case around the role of investment and private enterprise in creating good in the world. Carol has talked about bringing NGOs together and creating mergers, not just funding them in their work. Is there, let me ask Tony first, but then I'd like to hear from all of you, is there a risk, is there a problem in having philanthropists that move beyond philanthropy and that are not necessarily supporting the nonprofit sector in traditional ways, but are finding these new vehicles for social change?
I see it in a different way. I think that from time to time, we live in a dynamic world. We need to stop, assess our strategies, our approaches, our strategies. And if we think that they are not working as they should work in terms of productivity, in terms of delivery, in terms of outcome, then we should rethink the whole approach. So if we look at the issue of grant making, the way we have embraced it as a foundation is fairly different. We think that, yes, we have to give grants in sectors that are important to us, that we pursue. However, we think, again, based on what I've espoused, the philosophy driving what we believe in, that we should make people fishermen rather than giving them fish every time. So that is our own. So yes, I think that you need to, at some point in time, question certain orthodoxies to be able to make progress in life. Yes.
Thank you. Laurence?
Well, I think questions are always asked of foundations, and philanthropists, how are you accountable? I think philanthropists and foundations should be accountable, but it doesn't mean that society cannot take in the diversity and the pluralism that all the philanthropists represent. We are accountable because we are also a public charity that produces results for the people. But I think there are many different approaches, and I would encourage people to experiment. There's no one way of doing doing things, of solving problems in the world. There are many different ways. And if all philanthropists would just experiment, it will emerge in the society that they are in, the better ways of doing things. And that would need to be a dialogue among decision makers as well in those communities.
Wonderful. Carol?
In Brazil, we like to use a term called social investment, and we try nowadays not to use the words benevolence, charity. We want to go further. We want to see what's going to happen, and we want to make sure that all the investments will be, the causes will be sustainable and will be engaged into society with no longer the needs of donations, of grant making. So we choose to have a period of involvement with the NGOs and then make sure that the social investment has been worth it and that the organizations are sustainable. So it's beyond what we call the charity and the assistentialism. I don't know if you use that word here.
And Carol, you mentioned to me earlier the idea that the word philanthropy is avoided, in fact, in part because of a history in Brazil of nonprofit organizations not really being trusted. There being issues with corruption and so on. It's interesting because in the US and Europe, we tend to think of nonprofits as the most trusted organizations. But in a context where nonprofits are not as trusted, there's more of a tendency for foundations to do things themselves, to do their own projects, to be more like an operating foundation. Is that a trend you see in Brazil?
I think this is changing. I was talking earlier to Marcos Kiso and Fernando Rossetti. Of the 340,000 nonprofit organizations in Brazil, we could say that only 200 are not legitimate, which is a very small number. But when they are not legitimate, they tend to make a lot of noise and attract a lot of attention. But this is changing, and I feel today that these organizations are very trustworthy, and we can see it because the results are very obvious today. And for a while, most of the foundations today in Brazil are what we call executive foundations. They operate their own causes, which in some ways is very positive, but I also think that this should not be the model for the future, because operating your own organization, at one point you might shift from concentrating on the cause and concentrate on your own organization, which is a danger, because if you want your organization to survive, sometimes you stop concentrating on the cause. And this is why I believe that if all the foundations and NGOs come together and have an infrastructure and regulatory mechanisms to support them, auto-regulatory mechanisms to support them, then they will shift from operating organizations, which is the majority today in Brazil, to grant making for the very trustworthy organizations that are being created in Brazil.
And Tony, we hear a lot about the tremendous explosion of philanthropy in India, in Latin America, in China, and other places. What's happening with philanthropy by Africans in Africa?
We have two categories of philanthropists in Africa. First is the ones who've always had sense, and they are usually funded from outside. And so they receive funds for the different causes. Then we have the emerging type, new ones, which is Africa funded and Africa funded and also Africa based. And I think I saw Thelma, somebody here from the T.Y. Danjuma Foundation, which is one of the Africa funded foundations that we have. The Tony Elumelu Foundation, and a few in South Africa. So I would say across Africa, quite a few. However, something is being done to encourage this. We are working jointly to encourage and put in place a proper legislation in respective African countries so that we all have the rules that guide, so that part of what you talked about in Brazil, you don't want to see them happen. And also we think there are Africans who would like to participate, who would like to support humanity in manners that are quite sustainable, but we think some of them don't know how to go about it. So some of us have a key role to play in making sure that we don't only do good through our own foundations, but we also catalyze and become truly catalytic across the continent so that others can come on board and do the same thing. I note what you said about the convening in Singapore, and it's something we'll also think about. Thanks.
Terrific. And Laurence, you work not just in Singapore, but in China and Vietnam. What has been your experience of working in other countries, and how have you found ways to be effective in those regions?
I think some of the issues in other parts of the world, you see them manifested in Asia as well. The NGOs tend to be a bit weaker, so a bit less trusted. So you find that outside Singapore, in Singapore there's a different dynamic. The charities are trusted, but they are not exactly the most effective. But outside Singapore, we find that many can't be even trusted because of leakage and corruption and so on. And many foundations actually start their own programs, which have its own problems, because how do you scale up, how do you sustain? If it's a small program, how do you develop expertise? And we find that when we do water and sanitation projects, we've had to put people on the ground. So we have few officers in Cambodia, in Vietnam, and China. You have to look for the right partners. There are a lot of bad partners to work with, so you must have that robust process of identifying good partners to work with. And you keep on deepening those relationships. But we find that it's impossible to run away from putting your own people on the ground.
That's very interesting. I'm going to open it up to questions in a minute, so think about the questions you have, and we'll also get some questions from Twitter. But I also wanted to ask one last question. There are many people in the room here who are interested in funding in Africa, in China, in Vietnam, in Latin America, who are based in Europe or the US. What advice would you have for them about how to be effective funding in your countries, in your regions? Tony?
I think first is to identify credible local partners, okay, and also ensure that there's alignment between what you plan for the respective African communities and what is truly important to them. So, just like what Tony Blair said yesterday about China and the West, it happens every time. So what you consider important in certain environments might be different when you take them to like Africa. So find the right partner, very important, to align, let there be alignment between what you plan to do and what actually is required. That way we can again create this kind of social wealth that's important. All parts coming together, the donor, the recipients coming together and making sure that how they want to intervene will actually create the true intent of the intervention.
Thank you. Carol?
I agree with Tony. I think that finding the best partner is the way to go. But I also believe that you should have a good field trip and visit the area and stay in the area for a while, understand the country, its politics. We have very favorable politic grounds today in Brazil, the economic growth, the safety nets provided by the government within the past 25 years have been socially very relevant. So I believe that and you can find quite a few partners in the private sector, in foundations, and in local NGOs. So I think that this is the best way.
I think in addition to what has already been mentioned, I would strongly recommend focus and really dedicating your attention to just one particular area, and not just in terms of geography, but in terms of field of interest. Because, I mean, how do you find best partners if you are not knowledgeable about the area yourself? I think over time, I hope that to see much more community-based intermediaries like community foundations spring up in Asia, because those would be the best partners. Going back to the point that communities know what is best for themselves. I would fund community foundations in the future, definitely.
Good. So let's take some questions. Anyone questions? And if you want to send a question by Twitter, I see a question over here we'll start with. The hashtag, if you want to send a question by Twitter, the hashtag is GPF2012. And please say who you are and who you'd like to address your question to.
Thank you. My name is Nyara Zai. I'm the General Secretary of the World YWCA and the founder of Rosaria Memorial Trust in Zimbabwe. I have a question to Tony. How are you engaging with the market women? We know that in Africa, women are entrepreneurs, and they are already giving in multiple ways, but maybe not in the formal sense of how philanthropy is organized in different countries. To what extent is your foundation looking at leveraging the potential that is there on the continent of strategic relationship with market women and women in the informal sector? Thanks.
Thank you.
I think I like to say our foundation does not really discriminate in terms of our intervention, but we have different schemes for different categories. We have looked at entrepreneurship in Africa in 3 baskets. First is the startups. 2 is to try to encourage the startup businesses to move to the next level, the SME level. 2, we want to encourage the SMEs to move to the national growth companies. And 3, we want to encourage the national growth companies to become the African multinational companies. So in that basket, like the startup areas, we have both women and men. So what we do is to identify the requirements of each sector. So this first category, they need certain advisory services, how to structure the accounting record, keep a good accounting records, how to know that there's a difference between personal money and the kind of business they are running so that they don't mix things up, create some ambition in their minds that we're not just doing this for today, but want to transit to the next level and let them see hope that if they do things in a certain way, they will get to the next level. We also capacitize them. We also share knowledge with them by sending some of our people to talk to them. In fact, we do quite a lot, but we spend more time in the SME to the national growth companies. That is where we think the most impact will be felt across the continent. But we support all. No specific program for men, nor for women across board. Thanks.
Another question? Jane. It's coming.
Yeah,
this is for Tony as well. There's pretty significant economic growth in your home country of Nigeria and elsewhere in Africa, South Africa and elsewhere. What are the barriers or what are the key means of ensuring that growth is more widely felt? It sounds like from startup to small enterprise might be your answer. And what are the barriers to investment in startups and very small enterprises? Is there a risk-loving venture community?
I think the first question is one of the things we're trying to do is what we call national competitiveness. We think that the greatest challenge is, we have natural resources in Africa, but we also import finished products or goods into Africa. Why is this so? It is so because of lack of investment in key sectors. Why do we have lack of investment in key sectors? Because we think that the African environment, some are not as competitive as they should be to attract capital. Capital has no coloration, so if you want capital to come to your destination, prepare very well to have it there. So what are we doing about this? We're creating the awareness. Again, that's what I said about private sector before, about Africa, creating the awareness for the leadership in Africa to understand that if we want this to happen in terms of, not just that we have resources, we have oil, but then almost all African countries import oil, finished oil products into Africa. So we need to move to the level where beyond just having natural resources, we're able to process and meet the local demand in the local country and across Africa. To do that, we must create the right environment for businesses to do well. If we do that, people will come, people will invest, businesses will do well. So I think making our economies very competitive is key to addressing the issue. In fact, for both issues, actually, it's very, very important. Impediments to investment, again, SME level. People, I think, again, it's about creating the right environment. Opportunities are there, but let's create the right environment that will encourage people to come in. Rule of law, the hard infrastructure, the soft infrastructure that will make investment succeed. But then, if you have, as we said before, the right local partners, you can navigate some of these challenges. I say to people, in credit, avoidance of credit is not a risk. It's not the issue. It is how to mitigate risks when they come up. So if it's a difficult terrain to do business, then how do you mitigate those challenges?
Thank you. There's a question over here, this gentleman, and then behind him.
I have a question for Laurence. I'm Steve Alderman from the Peter Alderman Foundation. A similar question that Jane asked. What are the barriers to palliative care? Scale up. In other words, to me, it seems like a no-brainer. In this country, it is the only discipline of medicine that's completely customer-driven. You want the people to feel better. And secondly, by keeping people comfortable and at home, you avoid hospital costs, and so you drive down healthcare costs. What is standing in the way of government scaling this up?
Scaling
Palliative care.
Yeah.
Well, it's a complex issue. And one of the issues that that was raised here is about the lack of access to pain relief, morphine in particular. Part of the issue is, you have issues on both the demand and supply side. Okay? On the supply side, morphine is considered a narcotics drug, and so you have the drug authorities destroying as much morphine as they can get their hands on, the drug enforcement authorities, that is, and you have the doctors not being able to get morphine in their hands to give to the patients. On the demand side, a lot of doctors are not aware of the use of palliative care, that it can be administered in a home environment, for example, and that is beyond the use for cancer causes and illnesses. So we have to work on both sides. The supply side to address the regulatory environment, and the demand side to educate doctors and the patients themselves. Because when we started promoting the use of hospices in Singapore, for example, people had a conception of hospices as death houses, that when you go there, you will actually somehow die faster, and invite death. But actually, the results show that it actually lengthens the number of days because you are so comfortable and you are actually happy. So we have to address doctors, the healthcare professionals, the patients themselves, as well as the regulatory authorities.
Terrific. We have a question on Twitter for Carol. What were the challenges you faced while trying to consolidate the various NGOs across Brazil and to get them to talk to each other?
That's a very interesting question, because there is a big challenge having NGOs talk to each other, because Each NGO has their own system of operating, and as I said, every community knows what is better for them. So when you put them together, basically, they have to come up with one idea that is good for both. And sharing success stories is the way to go, because when you show people what has been successful and what has worked, then they will automatically trust you. So when you have two different NGOs working together, let's say in health, you have to, again, I always say that reinventing the wheel is not a good idea. So if you get one good example or two good examples from different NGOs and you present them to health caused NGOs, then this is what tends to happen. They will move towards that success story and try to replicate it. So it's based on cases.
Terrific. There was a question in back there.
I'm Kat Rosquetta from the Center for High Impact Philanthropy at the University of Pennsylvania. Laurence, you encourage people to experiment so that better solutions could emerge. I would love an example of an experiment that was very disappointing in terms of the results, but very instructive in terms of helping you identify a better solution.
I think one example is one of our sanitation programs in Cambodia. We decided, well, it's a good idea since most of them didn't have toilets, and for cost effectiveness to build communal toilets for villages. And so we built this wonderful communal facility, and when we went back later, about 6 months to a year later, the facility was locked, and nobody had access to it. And the reason was that they couldn't figure out how, who had the authority to, or responsibility to maintain it, and how to charge for it, and to recover the cost to maintain the toilet. So that was not a very successful project. And we said, well, I think you need to put toilets into every home, but how do you scale that up? Because that would be very costly. And we decided that the best way was to sell toilets, to sell latrines, so very simple systems. I think, Katrina, you know the story. So we invested together with partners like IDE. In fact, it was a US AID-funded project that started this off. We basically developed the industry and the supply chain. You have all these agents going out to sell these latrines. We brought the price point of the latrine down by to less than 50% of the original cost. We were told that we can't do this. This is an aid-dependent country. They would never purchase toilets, but people did, and we sold 16,000 latrines in 1 year, and other partners sold thousands as well. So that was, I think, an example that went from failure to success.
Great. Okay. We had one question here. Well, why don't we take two quick, short questions together, if we could.
Hello, Lorene Arbus, and my question is for Tony. In Nigeria, there is, as I understand it, a nascent but very impressive film business. And I wanted to ask you if you and or others in the philanthropic sphere have looked at that business as a possibility for impact investment and game changing.
And if you just pass the microphone, and one other quick question, we're almost out of time.
My name is Catherine Ann Provine from Pillars for Life Foundation to Laurence. And when you did find the supply to help the palliative care, did you find the hospitals receptive that you wanted to improve the care that they thought that they were providing? And what methods did you go about convincing them?
Great. Tony, perhaps you'll respond.
Thanks for a very interesting question about the Nollywood. That's what it's called in Nigeria. Basically, we, as I said before, do not have specific industries that we focus on. It's just across, okay? But the point you raised calls for our attention. So we're going to look into it when we go back. Thank you.
Laurence?
Well, most of the work that we do with hospitals is in Singapore. And obviously, palliative care is very low on the priority when we engage hospitals. physicians, doctors. I mean, they are all trained to bring people alive, right? To keep people alive, and that's their focus. So helping people die well is way down on the priority list. And I think one very useful program that we started was to get doctors talking about death. So we did a major study that interviewed doctors to tease out the attitudes towards death, not just among the patients, but among the doctors. How do you treat your patients? What are the issues that you have to deal with? And that was publicly debated. And I think that was very helpful to move the dialogue and the practice on. Thanks.
Thank you. It's so fascinating to listen to this panel because I think years ago there was an assumption that America is exporting how to do philanthropy to the rest of the world. And I think if there was any shred of that notion still around, this panel puts to rest that idea and suggests that we in America have a great deal to learn about effective models of philanthropy by studying what is happening and emerging in other countries. So please join me in thanking our excellent panelists this morning.